as human beings in general, we love stories about people, unlikely people, who are thrust into heroic situations, people who are brought into royalty or fame or popularity from unlikely circumstances or situations. We can think of how much we love like something like March Madness, where we have a 16 seed in the NCAA tournament make it all the way to the Final Four and have a chance of winning the whole thing. We think about a musical artist who comes from nothing. Nobody knows who they are, and they rise to fame and prominence, and they win a Grammy. We think about someone like Robbie, through hard work and discipline, lifting weights and getting to the point where he's almost as strong as Zach. That stuff is just simply inspiring. We love Cinderella stories. I think one of the reasons why I love Robbie, I feel like I make fun of him a little too much. It's affection, that's the way I show towards him, just officially. Later. So, one of the reasons deep down I think that we as people like Cinderella stories is because it taps into something that is true about the human experience of living in the world that God made, and it actually tells us something really significant about the story that God has actually written from the very beginning of the world that we actually live in. You see, the Bible is filled, as we think about the Bible as really the story of the whole world, we can see that the Bible is filled with unexpected, unlikely, underdog, and Cinderella stories. And actually, the larger story of the Bible and how God saves sinners is one of these stories that's really unlikely and unexpected. And if we were to write the story for ourselves, we probably wouldn't have written it the way that God did. But thankfully for us, this is how God works, and he takes unlikely and unexpected and unimpressive things and people, and he works it all together in his perfect plan. Now, as we step into the book of Ruth tonight and we continue to study it together, we are going to see that the book of Ruth is a smaller story in the larger story of the Bible. This is exactly what we see in this book. The book of Ruth is a small but crucial puzzle piece in God's unusual and unexpected plan to save sinners. So as we dive into chapter 1 tonight, I want to just look at this chapter 1 in 3 scenes. And if you think about scenes in a movie, and the first scene that we're going to see here is going to be a backdrop of darkness that's actually going to be really crucial as we think about the whole story, what it's about, and how we'll see how in a really dark situation, God is going to unexpectedly and in seeming ways unimpressively work together his plan in some really unexpected ways. So 3 points for you guys tonight are the 3 scenes that we see in chapter 1. And this will kind of be the chapter 1, the heading is Dark Clouds, a Loyal Daughter, and a Bitter Homecoming. Those 3 phrases are going to be our points for tonight. Dark clouds in verses 1 through 5. I'm going to read these as we go here, and we'll have a chance to just kind of tackle this book one chunk at a time as we study together. So, Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. It says this, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The one name was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband." So we'll stop there, and we'll consider these opening 5 verses. And we see, I want you to think about it this way, that the very beginning of this story, that the context, the setup, the situation that we're kind of invited into here, think about 2 really dark clouds that are looming over our story. 2 really dark clouds, and both of these dark clouds exist because of disobedience. Disobedience on the part of God's people as a whole and both as individuals. So the first cloud that looms over our story is the famine that exists in this story because of Israel's disobedience. You'll see in verse 1 that there is the phrase that says, in the days when the judges ruled. You guys, for your homework, is to go back in this week, start reading through the book of Judges if you want some extra credit for SI. Go back and read the book of Judges, and you'll be introduced to this, one of the most brutal and ugly and nasty parts of the Bible that tells the history of Israel during a time where the people of Israel were disobedient. They wouldn't listen to what God said. They wanted to live outside of God's plan. And we see Israel going through these ugly moments that are ultimately ruled by disobedience and God's people wanting what God doesn't want for them. The very last verse of the book of Judges closes with this bitter note where it says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So Israel, as a nation, as God's people, are living in constant disobedience. And in general, people are just doing whatever seems right to them and not listening to what God has to say. And that's the context that sets us up here. And this is really bad because if we go back to Deuteronomy, we can see that God has actually given his people a warning and a promise. Way back in Deuteronomy, there was a promise that if Israel was obedient, if they actually listened to what he said, God's people will be blessed with victory in battle, food to survive, and fertility for their people, so that they would continue to have children and generations upon generations. So that would be the blessing if they obeyed. But the contrast to that is if they chose to disobey God and not live according to his plan for them, that the exact opposite would actually happen. That they would experience the curse of defeat in battle, and they would experience famine and starvation, and they would actually experience infertility. So God says, if you basically have a choice to make. You choose to obey, and you'll be blessed. But if you choose to disobey, you'll be cursed. And the sad story that we see play out in Judges, and what starts our story here in the book of Ruth, is a disobedient people who now have the dark cloud of famine looming over this situation that we're in. So there's this first dark cloud of famine caused by disobedience, and it actually acts as a catalyst for the second cloud that we're going to look at, the second cloud of death that comes to a guy named Elimelech and his family on this individual level. So this guy named Elimelech, who we're told he takes his family to the land of Moab when this famine hits in order to get more food. So this is bad on top of bad, and you might initially go like, yeah, of course you would go and try and find food to take care of your family. But think about this. Israel is being disciplined and punished by God for their disobedience. And then Elimelech goes, okay, instead of repenting and turning to God in obedience, he goes to this place called Moab, which if we were to read back in our Bibles, we actually find that Moab were some of the most notorious enemies of the nation of Israel. They are essentially God's enemies in a nutshell. And so Elimelech says, oh, God sent a famine because of our disobedience. Okay, I'm going to go and look for help from Moab, from God's enemies. So he goes even deeper into a lack of faith and trust in God, and even deeper into disobedience. So it's bad on top of bad. And as a result of this, tragically, rather than finding relief from the discipline of God, Elimelech's disobedience brings further curses. And in verse 3, we see that not only does Elimelech die, leaving behind his wife, and Naomi and their 2 sons, we see that even 10 more years pass, and this disobedience has further consequences as they remain in the land. And these 2 husbands and the 2 sons of Naomi and Elimelech also pass away, leaving behind really only Naomi, and then Ruth and Orpah, who were the Moabite women who the sons had married when they were there. So that's a lot going on there, but it is this consistent theme of not trusting God in what he said, choosing to find different options or alternatives to try and get out of the discipline that God has already brought upon his people and consequently, God continuing to bring discipline and judgment on Israel and then individually on this family. The dark clouds of these first 5 verses, even though not many of you are probably tempted to take Moabite wives, I don't know what your dating situation is, but that's probably not something that you're tempted with. But if we think about the principle of what's going on here, we see this picture of God's plan and his rules and these prohibitions and these guidelines, and God's people who are choosing to live outside of that and try and figure out things on their own. And so as we look at these dark clouds here in verses 1 through 5, I want you to ask the question for yourself. To ask the question, are there times in which I have failed to trust God, in some area of my life chosen to disobey his instruction for my life, and as a result suffered some kind of negative consequences that potentially could be the simple consequences of the discipline that God's brought on my life for living outside of his plan? We do this individually. We do this as a community. We do it as a church. We do this as a nation. We have to think, are there ways that we're living outside of God's plan that may be bringing discipline from God on our lives or negative consequences? Something to consider as we continue through this story. So these dark clouds provide this backdrop, but it's in this darkness and this backdrop that we start to see some glimmers of God's love and his character and some hope in the main characters of the story. Can you click my next slide? So we got dark clouds. In our biggest section here, we have a loyal daughter. This is where we're going to meet the person who this book is named after. And there are really 3 main characters in this book that you really need to have underlined and pay attention to what they're like, what they're about, and how you see something that's true about God shining through each of them, both positively and negatively. And the 3 characters are going to be Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. And it's here that we're introduced really personally to something about Naomi and Ruth. Okay, so think about at this point in the story, you're watching a movie on the book of Ruth. This is where the camera zoomed out for kind of looking at these dark clouds of these circumstances, the disobedience, and now it's zooming in and getting a little bit of a closer picture of the actual characters and what they're like. So Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth, not Oprah, as we made the mistake in our small group last week. It's Orpah. Naomi is the mom, the widowed mom, and then Orpah and Ruth are the Moabite women. So the people from Moab, from the God's enemy people, who the 2 sons had married who had since died. So it's these 3 girls who are stuck back together, and the 3 of them are in a bad situation that has a lot of layers of bad going on here. So they're in a famine. So a famine, right now, you guys could go to 7-Eleven or Whole Foods and just probably even if you don't have anything on you, use your mom's credit card and get some brown rice or something. Back then, a famine would have been dire circumstances in the economic, social, cultural situation. So there is a famine in the land. There is not food to eat. People are starving to death. So you think about the situation in a third world country where people don't have access to food and water and those things. That is the discipline that God has brought upon this group of people. And this is what Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth are experiencing firsthand. Now on top of that, Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth are widows. So their husbands have died. Now, maybe we think of this thing where you're oh, they're, single ladies, you're going to figure it out and do it on your own. Back then, in the cultural setting and in the social situation that was going on back then, this would have been essentially a death sentence in the current situation where because they did not have family, because they did not have a husband as a provider in the situation, women in this culture back then, if you did not have a husband, you were in a really, really bad situation. And so these 3 women are experiencing the threat of starvation, and then on top of it, they don't have husbands and they're widowed. So they're knocked down all these notches on the social standing hierarchy. And then on top of that, which is included in their being widowed, they don't have children, which was also just a significant negative thing viewed in that culture. And so it's bad on top of bad for these women, but their bad situation is met with this glimmer of hope as they hear that the Lord, in these verses, has provided food in the midst of the famine back in Judah. So as it turns out, God is actually caring for his people who stayed in the promised land and stayed where they were supposed to be. Now, because Naomi was a Jew, she'd come from Judah, it made perfect sense for her to go back to her homeland, for her to return and to be with her people. And Elimelech, who brought her there, is gone. Her sons are gone. It would make sense for her to come back. But it's not such an easy decision for Orpah and Ruth. Orpah and Ruth had come from Moab. They had lived their lives there. The rest of their family was there. Really, the only thing that would potentially even connect them back to Judah was this tree of relationship that gets them to Naomi. And so Orpah and Ruth are all that Naomi have back in Moab. And so Orpah and Ruth have to make this decision as Naomi's decided to return where there's food. Did they leave their homes where they've been their whole lives to follow Naomi? Did they leave behind what have always been their friends, their community, their comfort, all these things, to choose to become strangers and sojourners in a land where they will not belong, where they will be viewed as Moabite women, enemies of God? Who in their right mind would go, yeah, I'm going to sign myself up for that? So Naomi, and actually I think an expression of her really caring about these daughter-in-laws that she has, basically says to them, girls, I'm going back home. It makes no sense for you to come with me. I'm going to leave you behind here because I care about you. I'm going to go. It's right that you would stay and remain behind. That's what we see in verses 8 and 9. She says, your family lives here. There's nothing for you if you come with me. And I love in this story, there's just an intense emotional reality that we see here, because it says that they all just get together and they weep together. These three have actually come to love each other. You think about anytime you go through like the worst things of like a loved one dying, or you go through something really difficult with a close friend, you see the way that those things tend to like knit people's hearts together. I think that's what you see here with Naomi and Ruth and Orpah. They've come to love each other, and that love that they already have for each other was only deepened by this bereavement and this loss. But we see here that Naomi basically just says, you cannot come with me. What good could it possibly do to come back? My sons are dead. She says, what could I possibly do for you guys? Am I going to have 2 more sons that you would wait for them to marry you when they're old enough? She says, it makes absolutely no logical sense for you to follow me. So Naomi, in the name of what she thinks is best for them, says, go. God has dealt bitterly with me, and staying with me will bring you nothing but sorrow. And we see here in these verses that Orpah says, I understand. It says she kissed her and she went back home. When I read these verses, I think if I'm being honest with myself, I say, like, it makes sense what Orpah did, right? So all of if she's asking the question, what do I do to survive? What is the best way to get through this brutal situation? Orpah probably makes the best choice. And as she's essentially chosen the thing that would be best for her, we see something astounding in contrast in Ruth's response to this. She says these words. It says she clings to Naomi and she says, do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. Those verses 16 and 17, are crucial, especially what Ruth says in verse 16, if we're going to start to learn who Ruth is and what her role is in this story. We see Ruth choose astounding and confounding loyalty to Naomi over and above comfort, over and above family, and over and above security. She's essentially making a decision that if she's asking the question of what's the best thing for me to do to survive, she's picking the worst possible option. when we understand all of the levels of what challenges she would be facing, we really should ask the question of going, what in the world would make Ruth want to make that decision and to return with Naomi? There's something crucial in verse 16 that I think will help us to understand why Ruth would make this decision, because she's essentially jumped into a boat that is visibly headed towards the edge of a waterfall in every sense of the word. Ruth, as we consider what she's done, reminds me a lot of an American missionary who's pretty well known named Jim Elliot. Jim Elliot is an American missionary well known for being one of 5 men who flew into one of the most dangerous villages in Ecuador decades ago. And he was among those who were killed in an attempt to share the gospel with a group of indigenous people, men and women who had never heard about who Jesus was. There's a book called Through the Gates of Splendor, and there's a movie called The End of the Spirit that they made about this guy's life and the people that he was with. And one of the things that stuck out to me as I've read his story and I've looked at the choices that he made in his life, and actually what led to his death, is that he left relative comfort, security, family, a good life in America. He had kids. He had this life that would have seemed like such a precious thing to hold on to. And he made the choice to go with these missionaries and to join a team where people were telling him, they're saying, you are probably going to lose your life making this decision that you're making. He knew that that was a good possibility, that what would happen would happen. But Jim Elliot made this decision because he wanted to tell people about Jesus, so much so that he was willing to lose everything in order to tell people about Jesus. And in any worldly standard, the decision that he made to go was crazy, unwise, and illogical. As it turns out, that kind of a decision is a fundamental part about what it means for someone to follow Jesus, to be a Christian. There's a passage in Mark 8 where Jesus tells his followers, he says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. He says, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel will save it. It's completely counterintuitive to the way that we think. It's completely illogical if we're trying to go, what is the best way to survive life in America, to survive with my popularity, to survive in my social standing? Being a Christian is never the thing that seems like at the top of the list that is going to make sense. And Jesus warns his followers. He says, you have to lose your life in order to actually gain it and to actually follow me and to find life in me. See, God's people are those who understand that there's nothing in life that isn't worth giving up in exchange for the life that's to be found in knowing God himself. Isn't that something of a picture of what Ruth does here in this chapter? And it's so crucial. I point in verse 16, the key to understanding why Ruth was willing to give up everything to remain with Naomi was because she says, Naomi, your God, the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, the God of Christianity, says, this God is my God. And so Ruth's loyalty to Naomi is not so much about loyalty to Naomi. It's loyalty to Naomi's God that bleeds out into loyalty and love towards Naomi. It's a picture of understanding that there is nothing not worth giving up in order to have God himself as your God. When they found Jim Elliot's journal after he had died, they found in one of the entries in his journal one of my favorite quotes of all time that I think just captures what it is to have the Christian perspective on your life. He says, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. He is no fool to lose what he can't keep to gain what he can't lose. It's this perspective on who God is and how much better he is than everything else. And understanding that everything that's worth having is wrapped up in who he is. So much so that all this stuff in our lives is just relatively worthless compared to knowing God himself. It's a profound perspective on life we can only achieve if we come to understand what both Jim Elliot and Ruth both understood to be true about God. I wonder if some of you here who are here tonight really think that to be true about God. Because there's a good chance that there are some of us who would just look at this Christianity thing and we go like, it's kind of like this name tag that I throw on. I go like, I'm a good person who goes to church. But have you thought that in order to gain true life to be found in God, you've got to be willing to lose your life for Jesus? It's costly, and it's kind of crazy to do it. And ultimately, if you're a Christian, you've got to make that decision to do what Jim Elliot did, to do what Ruth does here. Our third and our brief point here, verses 19 through 22. We see this decision that Ruth makes to stay with Naomi, to remain with her, which leads to the two of them sojourning, traveling back to Judah. And as they return to Bethlehem, the city and the people, says they're stirred up over their return. And if you understand these circumstances, you can understand why. Because Naomi's been gone for like decades at this point. And they're like, is that Naomi? Where's Elimelech? They find out that Elimelech is dead. And instead, this rando Moabite lady is with her, and nobody knows who Ruth is. They're going, you brought a Moabite with you? And they're trying to figure out everything that's going on, and the place is stirred up. It's going crazy. And they're like, is this really Naomi that's back all these years later? And Naomi, in a really interesting perspective on her situation that I think is actually half right and half wrong, she kind of gives us an evaluation of her situation. She says, don't even call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara, which means bitter, because my life is nothing but bitter suffering. There's a lot that we can say about Naomi, and there's a lot that we can say about that statement right there. But I think what's going to be crucial as we look onward into this story is that Naomi has rightly understood that she is under God's judgment, and that God has actually left her bitter in many respects because of this discipline that's been left on her. But what Naomi is missing is understanding to see through this bitterness and this judgment, to see actually the kindness of the God who has shown this discipline towards her. And thankfully, as we move on in this story, we're going to see something further about God's character, that though he is a God who shows judgment and discipline, he is a God who shows loving kindness as well. And what Naomi's missing, as she just says, call me Mara, call me bitter, that she's already experienced the loving kindness of God through what Ruth has done in showing her loyalty and showing her just a small picture of the kind of loyalty that God shows to his people. As we conclude, as we walk away from Ruth 1, as we move on through this story, I want you to consider this. What I just said, that loyalty that Ruth shows to Naomi is just a small glimpse, a little picture of the perfect, steadfast, loving kindness and loyalty that God has for his people, that we actually see ultimately and perfectly in Jesus. When you think about all that Ruth was willing to give up in order to follow Naomi and be loyal to her, you can look at Jesus. And you kind of look at that picture we see in Philippians 2, where we see that God actually, Jesus, in being this perfect relationship with God the Father, God the Holy Spirit, and God the Son, Jesus is in heaven and everything is perfectly fine. He's perfectly comfortable. He's sitting on his throne. There's no reason that he had any need to come after us, to come and become a man and to come down to earth. But it's out of love that God actually steps down into our situation and enters the world that he created in order to save us. And Jesus actually, in such clear and seemingly crazy ways, he actually becomes this sojourner and this stranger and this person who has nowhere to lay his head as he comes down to earth. He's born into a manger. He's just a wandering man for 30 years of his life with nowhere to stay. God, Jesus, chooses to step into that. Why? At any point, Jesus could have just been like, I'm out, and go back up to heaven where everything's perfect. But he endures through all of that. And the Bible tells us that he endures that for the joy that was set before him. And he endures through what is relatively a miserable life with no comfort, no security, none of those things. And he goes through his life all the way to the cross, all the way to the grave. And the thing that pushes him through that is that loyalty and that steadfast love that we see a glimpse of in Ruth, that we see perfectly in Jesus. And it's the steadfast love and loyalty that Naomi gets undeservedly from Ruth, that you and I have to understand is freely available to us in Jesus. And when we look at the life that he lived, the death that he died, and that he rose from the grave and conquered death, we go, that love and that loyalty was just lavished on me and shown to me. And if you're a Christian and you've experienced that, you'll do what Ruth did in going, I understand that love's been shown to me, and that love is reproduced in my life, in the way that I treat other people, and the character of God is lived out through us. So that's the picture that I want to leave you with. Ruth, just a small picture of what we perfectly see in Jesus. Let's pray, and we're going to sing one more song. Father, thank you for this wonderful story that's filled with all this drama and all of this darkness and all of these unexpected twists and turns that if we were to write this story ourselves, we would have never done it the way that you did it. But we're so thankful that in your perfect plan, in this unexpected and seemingly unimpressive way, you use these people, these characters, these circumstances. You even use the disobedience of Israel and the disobedience of Elimelech and the bitterness of Naomi. You work it all together in your perfect plan to bring us to where we are now and to actually give us Jesus. Thank you that the way that we can look at the characters in these stories and see little glimpses of your love and your character and who you are perfectly to each of us if we've trusted in Jesus. Pray that everyone here tonight would come to understand that in a deeper and a truer way as they look to Jesus, the one who we can experience all of your love and all of your kindness and all of your loyalty in. Pray this in Jesus' name.